Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be talking about Mephibosheth, 2 Samuel chapter 9. Our passage begins, verse 1, Then David said, Is there yet anyone left of the house of Saul? Now remember the parties involved. Saul had been the king of Israel. He had become the enemy of David, not through David's doing, but because Saul had become jealous of him. And so he says, Is there yet anyone left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness, not for Saul's sake, but for Jonathan's sake? Jonathan had been the very, very close friend of David. We get to verse 3. The king said, Is there not yet anyone in the house of Saul to whom I may show the kindness of God? And Ziba said to the king, There is still a son of Jonathan who's crippled in both feet. Now notice the crippling is mentioned here. It's going to be mentioned again at the end of this passage. And it had been mentioned, quite frankly, very much earlier in the book. You see, back in chapter 4, verse 4, we'd read about how Jonathan, Saul's son, had a son crippled in his feet. And then to tell us the backstory, he says he was 5 years old when the report of Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel, and his nurse took him and fled. And it happened that in her hurry to flee, why was she fleeing? Maybe she thought that David or the Philistines or somebody might have been after the child. But as it happened that in a hurry to flee, he fell and became lame, and his name was Mephibosheth. And the name perhaps is significant because the name, the Phibo part, or the Phi part, paha, is the word to cut. You put a mem in front of it, it describes the one who was cut. And then Bosheth is the word for that which is shameful. And so his lameness perhaps is seen as a shameful thing. After all, remember that's an honor and shame culture where to be strong and virile and to be able to run fast, that was honorable. To be lame, that was considered weakness. That was considered a shameful thing. Verse 4, So the king said to him, Where is he? And Ziba said to the king, Behold, he is in the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, in Lodebar. Then King David sent and brought him from the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, from Lodebar. Verse 6, Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and prostrated himself. And David said, Mephibosheth, and he said, Here is your servant. This is, notice, David is the master. Mephibosheth sees himself as the servant. Verse 7, David said to him, Do not fear, for I will surely show kindness to you for the sake of your father Jonathan. You see, Mephibosheth comes perhaps expecting to be put to death or dealt with in a dishonorable way, because that's what kings did. When they gained power, they would put to death their enemies and the families of their enemies. And Saul had been the enemy of David. He knows that. And instead, David says, Look, I'm going to restore to you all the land of your grandfather Saul, and you shall eat at my table regularly. And again, he prostrated himself. Mephibosheth does this, and said, What is your servant that you should regard a dead dog like me? He recognizes that he does not deserve the treatment, the good treatment that he is receiving. And so the story, notice it's laid out in a very structured way. You had in verse 1 David's desire to show kindness, and then he was informed by Ziba in verses 2 through 4 about the existence of Mephibosheth. We have this meeting in verses 5 and 6 where he meets Mephibosheth, and then he promises that son of Jonathan, Mephibosheth, that he will be taken care of in an honorable way. Next, we're going to see those instructions. Ziba will be mentioned again. His instructions are given to Ziba. And finally, the passage is going to end where David will follow through. First, he had started with a desire. He'll follow through with that desire. He will show kindness to Mephibosheth. And so we see the words of David in verse 9. And then the king called Saul's servant, Ziba, and said to him, All that belonged to Saul and to all his house I have given to your master's grandson. Verse 10, You and your sons and your servants shall cultivate the land for him, and you shall bring in the produce so that your master's grandson may have food. He's going to be able to, excuse the pun, stand on his own 2 feet. Nevertheless, he won't really need to do that. Nevertheless, Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall eat at my table regularly. And then just to let us know that this is no vain, he's not just passing the buck. Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. So this entire retinue now is put under Mephibosheth to serve him. Verse 11, Then Ziba said to the king, According to all that my lord the king commands his servant, so your servant will do. And so Mephibosheth ate at the king's table as one of the king's sons. Notice he's treated as if he's the son of the king. Verse 12, Mephibosheth had a young son himself, whose name was Micah, and all who lived in the house of Ziba were servants to Mephibosheth. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate at the king's table regularly. And then, just to remind us, this is how the story started. He was lame in both feet. Now, that whole story reminds us of something in the New Testament. David had been king of Israel. When we get to the New Testament, we find a greater David, the second David, the King of Kings. In the story of David, Mephibosheth was lame. In our story, we are all sinners. We're all spiritually lame. In David's story, Mephibosheth was descended from Saul, the enemy of David. We also have an ancestor. We're descended from Adam, the one who sinned, and yet we come to a second Adam, a last Adam, where we find our salvation. In David's case, Mephibosheth was invited to the king's table. We have also been invited to the Lord's table, and where we find not only did he invite us, not only do we come to his table where he prepared the meal, but that he is the meal. He says, take, eat, this is my body broken for you. Take, drink, this is my blood shed for you. We partake of him and we enter into eternal life.